The price of staying, why walking away from toxic workplaces is the most faithful thing you'll ever do. Good morning, beautiful souls. Welcome to Soft Girl Era, the sacred space where strong Black women unlearn survival, rediscover softness, and reclaim the joy, rest, and freedom they deserve without guilt, without apology, and without explanation. I'm your host, LeAnne Dolce, pronounced Dolce like sweet softness whispered in French. And I am your guide from burnout to boundaries, from doing to being, from strong to soft and loving every second of it. Today, I want to share something with you that shook me to my core, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about success, endurance, and what it means to walk in purpose as a Black woman in professional spaces. I recently had the profound honor of sitting down with Brittany Henderson, a visionary leader who is doing something revolutionary. She is shifting the paradigm in professional spaces by calling out the toxic dynamics that threaten the purpose, peace, and prosperity of Black professionals everywhere. Brittany is not just a voice, she is a movement. She is reminding wholesome people, people who are walking in integrity, faith, and excellence, that God's original design for their lives was never narcissism, manipulation, or emotional warfare. She is here to warn us, to steer us clear, because these interactions, these toxic, soul draining, purpose distorting interactions, can be truly life altering. And what I learned from Brittany Henderson in our conversation is something I believe will shake you awake, challenge what you've been taught about endurance, and invite you into a new way of protecting your calling. So let me share with you what Brittany revealed, because this is not just information, this is liberation. Here's the truth that Brittany brought to the table, and it stopped me in my tracks. Narcissism in professional spaces is not just a personality quirk to tolerate. It is a spiritual, emotional, and economic threat that can literally reroute a Black professional's destiny if left unchecked. Let that sit with you for a moment. We have been taught to push through, to be the strong Black woman or man who can endure anything for the bag, the title, the opportunity. We've been told that if we just work harder, stay longer, smile wider, we'll eventually be seen, valued, rewarded. But when you look closely at what narcissistic toxic leadership does, you see how it systematically erodes purpose, self trust, and even this ability to hear God clearly about your next move. In other words, staying in proximity to narcissism can be a form of agreeing with a counterfeit assignment on your life instead of God's original design. Brittany challenged me, and I want to challenge you with this perspective. Discernment, boundaries, and strategic exit plans are just as important to your professional toolkit as your degrees, your skills, and your network, especially for Black professionals. We are often conditioned to think that walking away from toxic environments is quitting or wasting an opportunity. But Brittany flipped that script and made it clear. Leaving a narcissistic leader, client, or partner can be one of the most purpose aligned and faith aligned decisions you ever make. Choosing to protect your emotional and spiritual health is not softness in the weak sense. It is soft girl era as spiritual strategy, moving gently, but with deep conviction, clarity, and non negotiable standards. So, Brittany is inviting Black professionals to see emotional safety, spiritual alignment, and healthy relationships as non negotiable success metrics, not optional luxuries. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because how many of us have been measuring success by the wrong metrics? How many of us have stayed in rooms that were killing us slowly because we thought endurance was the same thing as obedience? How many of us have called suffering faithfulness when God never asked us to stay? Let me share with you three stories that Brittany walked me through. Stories that illustrate just how serious this is. Stories that will break your heart and open your eyes. The first story is about a Black woman executive named Andrea Henderson. She was brought into an organization specifically to drive change and turn around a struggling environment. On paper, leadership claimed they wanted transformation. They said all the right things: diversity, equity, inclusion, empowerment. But in practice, she walked into a workplace that was deeply invested in protecting the status quo and undermining her authority as a Black woman leader. Entrenched stakeholders resisted the very changes they hired her to make. A toxic culture developed where information was withheld, trust eroded, and sabotage became normalized. As a high performing Black woman leader, Andrea was positioned to fail before she had a genuine chance to succeed. Think about that. She was hired to be the solution, but the system was designed to make her the scapegoat. This reflects how proximity to power doesn't guarantee support or psychological safety for Black professionals. In fact, sometimes it guarantees the opposite. Andrea came into the organization with the credentials, track record, and clarity needed to transform systems. Leadership presented her hiring as a progressive move, a sign they were ready for change and prepared to empower a Black woman leader. But once she stepped in, she found that beneath the inclusive language, there was a deep attachment to the existing power structures. People withheld information she needed, they resisted collaboration, they created conditions that made her look ineffective, despite her competence. And here's what's so insidious about this: it wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, it was quiet sabotage, death by 1,000 cuts, smiling faces, and closed doors. But here's what Andrea did: she became intentional about identifying who her true allies were and where organizational support actually existed, rather than trusting surface level promises. She emphasized the importance of asking questions about agendas, talking to as many people as possible, and comparing answers to detect misalignment and manipulation beneath the rhetoric. She recommended that Black women leaders secure resources, assess team quality, and evaluate whether leadership is truly committed to change before fully investing themselves in a new role. Andrea's story illustrates how, even when you are brought in as the solution, narcissistic or toxic leaders may still sabotage you to preserve their ego and control. Her experience highlights the need for early discernment, boundary setting, and realistic evaluation of leadership's true intentions. The broader impact of Andrea's story is that it gives language and strategy to Black women who feel gaslit in toxic jobs, especially when they are outwardly celebrated but internally sabotaged. Andrea's story encourages Black professionals to trust what they observe, not just what they are told, and to be willing to leave roles that weaponize their gifts against them. The second story is about a Black woman who was a senior executive at JP Morgan Chase. She filed a lawsuit alleging discrimination, sexual harassment, and retaliation. In her role, she was responsible for working with Black business owners and supporting racial equity initiatives within the bank. On the surface, this sounds like a dream role, a chance to serve her community, a chance to make a difference. But here's what she discovered. She alleged that Black business owners were disparaged, discouraged from applying for lending, and treated as problems when questioning the bank's racial equity results. Despite public commitments to racial equity, she claimed that lending to minority communities fell below the bank's 2019 baseline, contradicting the external narrative. She described internal cultural attitudes where leaders allegedly questioned why Black people believed the bank owed them anything, reflecting contempt and devaluation of Black communities rather than genuine partnership. Let that sink in. A major financial institution publicly proclaiming its commitment to racial equity, while internally questioning why Black people even deserve access. And when she challenged these practices and reported harassment, she said she faced retaliation and eventual termination. As a Black woman in a leadership role, tasked with helping Black business owners access capital, she occupied a position that, on the surface, aligned with her purpose. supporting her community. However, over time, she reportedly observed patterns that contradicted that mission, discouraging Black entrepreneurs, questioning loan applications, dismissing concerns about equity. When she raised issues and reported harassment instead of addressing the behavior, leadership allegedly retaliated, culminating in her termination. Her journey reflects how purpose aligned roles can still be weaponized in narcissistic systems that care more about appearance than integrity. Instead of silently enduring the environment, she chose to document what she was seeing and experiencing and ultimately filed a lawsuit, using the legal system as a form of resistance. By publicly challenging the gap between the bank's public racial equity promises and its internal behavior, she brought transparency and accountability into a space where narcissistic or image focused practices could otherwise remain hidden. The lawsuit made national news, drawing attention to how large institutions can project a woke or equity focused image externally while internally harboring dismissive or exploitative attitudes toward Black employees and Black owned businesses. Her actions sent a message to other Black professionals. You are not obligated to protect the image of institutions that are harming you or your community. The third story comes from a peer reviewed clinical report that describes a professional woman exposed to chronic interpersonal abuse in the workplace, in a dynamic commonly referred to as narcissistic abuse. She experienced severe psychological symptoms that resembled trauma spectrum disorders as a result of prolonged manipulation and emotional destabilization. She reported prolonged exposure to psychological manipulation and workplace abuse by a colleague, characterized by emotional withdrawal, unpredictability, and perceived psychological manipulation. She developed significant trauma related symptoms, intrusive recollections, nightmares, avoidance, hyperarousal, affective dysregulation, functional impairment. The report illustrates how chronic workplace toxicity can become life altering, even when there is no physical violence. It attacks self worth, emotional stability, and professional functioning. This professional initially engaged in the working relationship without fully realizing the severity of the psychological manipulation. Over time, the patterns accumulated: emotional withdrawal, devaluation, unpredictable treatment, perceived coercive control. The stress became so intense that she developed severe trauma related symptoms impacting both her work and personal life. It was only through recognizing the dynamic as abusive and not just difficult that she was able to seek the right kind of help. Treatment included trauma focused psychotherapy with cognitive behavioral strategies, psychoeducation, boundary work, and cognitive restructuring. She used a structured digital reflective tool between sessions to support narrative processing and reflection under clinical supervision. Critically, she implemented occupational disengagement, relocation, and a sustained no contact strategy with the abusive colleague, which mirrors what many survivors of narcissistic abuse must do to truly heal. At 6 month follow up, there was substantial reduction in self reported distress and progressive stabilization of psychological functioning, uh, demonstrating that healing is possible when people remove themselves from the source of harm and engage in trauma informed care. Although the report does not specify racial identity, it powerfully validates what many Black professionals experience, but are often encouraged to minimize. Toxic workplaces can be traumatic, not just stressful. The impact for our conversation is the evidence that no contact boundaries and exiting toxic environments are not overreactions. They are clinically supported pathways to recovery. For Black professionals and entrepreneurs, this reinforces the idea that leaving narcissistic environments is not failure. It is a path back to clarity, calling, and wholeness. So here's what I want you to take away from Brittany Henderson's Wisdom Today. First, narcissism is not just drama, it is a threat to your purpose, peace, and prosperity. Narcissistic behavior in business, whether from bosses, clients, collaborators, or partners, can create trauma level stress, undermine self worth, and derail careers if it is normalized or spiritualized as just a test. Recognizing it early is an act of self preservation and obedience to your calling, not an overreaction. Second, your discernment and boundaries are spiritual technology, not personality flaws, especially for Black professionals who have been labeled too sensitive, too much, or hard to manage when they refuse dysfunction. I want you to know that softness with self and firmness with narcissism is healthy. Asking questions, documenting behavior, setting limits, and planning an exit when necessary are powerful strategies, not signs of weakness. Third, you are allowed to choose environments that align with God's original purpose for you, even if that means leaving what looks impressive on paper. Titles, salaries, and brand names mean nothing if they require you to shrink, self betray, or endure abuse. Alignment is a metric of success. The right room for you is one where your gifts can flourish without bondage, manipulation, or emotional warfare. You are not obligated to stay where your soul is under attack. So I want to leave you with this question: where in your professional or entrepreneurial life have you been calling a narcissistic or toxic situation normal or just the price of success? And what would shift if you truly believe that God never designed you to be anyone's emotional supply, scapegoat, or punching bag? This is your invitation. Stop spiritualizing suffering that God never required. Stop calling endurance faithfulness when God is calling you to freedom. Stop sacrificing your peace on the altar of someone else's ego. This week, I challenge you to choose one concrete boundary or one intentional step of disengagement from a toxic relationship, client, beta boss, or collaboration that you know is misaligned with God's purpose for you. Document harmful interactions. Have a clarifying conversation about expectations. Start a transition plan out of that environment. Book a session with a therapist, coach, or mentor who understands narcissistic dynamics and Black professional realities. Because here's the truth: walking away is not quitting, it is the most faithful thing you will ever do. It is you saying to God, I trust that you have something better for me. It is you saying to yourself, I am worth more than this. It is you saying to the world, why my softness is my strength, and I will no longer apologize for protecting it. So go, choose you, choose softness, choose purpose, and watch what God does when you finally step into the room He designed for you all along.